Good morning, everyone. It's so nice to see you all here for chats. Or are you here because we're heating the library today? Either way, I'm glad to see such a wonderful turnout for John and his apples. I want to thank our sponsor, the First Bank. They have been our sponsor for several years now, and it helps make this project possible. Today we get to talk about John Bunker. He grew up in Massachusetts and California, moving to Maine in 1968. He's from away. He has lived in Palermo on Super Chili Farm for the past 41 years, where he and Cammy Watts grow vegetables, woody and herbaceous ornamentals, small fruits, and tree fruits. He coordinates nursery sales for Fedco, the co-op seed and nursery company in Clinton. But his passion is tracking down heirloom fruit varieties, particularly those originating in Maine. John established the Maine Heritage Orchard at the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association, MOFGA, in Common Ground and Unity. The orchard houses the only collection of apple varieties originating in Maine. Recently has begun a much larger Heritage Orchard preservation project at MOFGA. Eventually, the new orchard will be a home to 500 or more historic pear and apple varieties. The first 100 apple varieties were planted in April 2014. John coordinates an annual series of organic orchiding classes at MOFGA, the spring seed swap and scion exchange, and the October Great Maine Apple Day. John speaks and teaches in New England area regularly, and today he speaks at Skidompha. Please help me welcome John Bunker.
Hi, thank you very much for coming this morning. It's a pleasure to be here at Skidompha. And I guess you probably all know how it got its name. Some people might think it was some kind of Native American name, but it turns out it's not. So I'm going to talk today about Maine apple history, and including, in particular, the local apple history of Lincoln County and the Noblesboro, Damascotta, Bristol area, and my search for rare varieties, and that will include something about the orchard that we're doing at MOFGA up in Unity at Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners. And if you have a hard time hearing me, just wave or, okay, a little louder? Okay, so now is this any better now? Is this better? Yeah. Okay, so, what I'm going to do is I'm going to speak for somewhere around 45 minutes. I know this is being videotaped, and the videotape's going to run out at some point, but I'll try to keep it as short as I can. And then I'm going to answer questions, and then if you have more questions and I haven't answered them, then I'm going to stick around until the last one of you leaves. So you can stay as long as you want and ask as many questions as you want, and I'm happy to be here as long as it takes. So I brought a bunch of handouts, and you probably saw some of those. You're welcome to any of them. I also brought books that are for sale and some posters, and there's also a few apples that I brought to show as a little display. And the apples in the display are just a tiny fraction of what was grown in Maine, but we're jumping ahead of ourselves, so we'll start back at the beginning. Before I talk too much about the actual history of apples in Maine, I need to tell you a couple of things about apples in general. The first, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to tell you a little geography and a little botany, but not too much of either. So first, the geography lesson, and it will be quick. The apples that we eat, and here's just a few of them, and I'll talk about them at some point. The apples that we eat or we use in pies or sauce or butter cake or bread or cider or whatever, did not originate in North America. They did not originate in Maine. They did not originate in Europe. They originated on the other side of the world, probably in Kazakhstan. And probably most of you have heard of Kazakhstan, but it's basically, we'll say, north and slightly east and a little bit west at the same time of Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, and very close to China. So over the years, researchers have spent a lot of time traveling around the world looking for the ancient forests of apples, and they found them in Kazakhstan. And so that's where we think that the apple originated. Now it so happens that all of you have heard of this person, Marco Polo. And Marco Polo was one of the few Europeans that went to China in the very early days. And you've all heard of the Silk Road. The Silk Road was never called the Silk Road until very recently. And it was not really a road. It was a series of trails that went crisscrossed all over the Middle East and connected India and China in the east with Egypt and Europe and Russia in the west. And traders moved back and forth from one side of the world to the other, basically. They didn't use ships, they went overland, bringing goods and raw materials back and forth from east to west. And it so happens that one of these, silk roads, you might call them, went right through Kazakhstan and went right through the areas where the apples, we think, originated. And when you go to Kazakhstan now, if you do, there are actually still forests of apples, not orchards, but forests. And those apples are all really good. They're very good tasting. They're all different sizes, shapes, and colors like ours are, but they have very few insects or diseases over there because this is their natural habitat. So what happened, we assume, is that these traders were moving across from China over into, Europe, and the trails went right through these forests, and their horses and their camels and so forth would eat the apples and deposit little fertilized apple seeds all along the Silk Road, and people would collect them in one way or another slowly over the years. The apple migrated its way all the way across the Middle East, eventually up into Russia, which has a very rich apple tradition, over into North Africa, where the pharaohs, amazingly enough, had orchards, and then eventually into Turkey, into Greece, Italy, and all of Europe. So that by very early on, we'll say, certainly 1,000 years ago, or not 2,000 years ago, there were apples spread all over really that entire part of the world, from Asia to Europe. So that's the geography lesson. The botany lesson goes like this, that every apple seed is unique. Now by that I mean this, that if you take a Macintosh seed, so you take your Macintosh apple, cut it in half, extract the seeds, and plant those seeds, you will always get an apple. And it will, if you take care of it, it will grow and it will produce a tree, and the tree will be an apple tree, and the apple tree will produce fruit. But the fruit will not be Macintosh. And you can do that to 10,000 Macintosh seeds, and every one of them will do the same. They'll produce a tree, so forth. But none of those seeds will be Macintosh. And none of them will be Honeycrisp or Fuji or Baldwin or Northern Spy or any other apple that's ever been ever before. Every apple seed equals unique. So that is absolutely essential information in understanding the history of apples in Maine or anywhere else, and also what I've been trying to do for the last 40 years. So every seed, and it's really easy to remember, every seed, unique. So we have apples originating halfway around the world at the same latitude as Maine, approximately 45 degrees. And we have these apples that do not come trinotype from seed. That's the way we put it. So what happened? How did we get from there to here? Well, what happened was this, and we'll get into the seed part in a little bit. We'll start with a little more geography. And that is that very early on in the European contact with North America, people were fishing off the coast of Maine. Portuguese, Scandinavians, eventually pretty much all European countries were scampering over here in their ships to fish the rich waters in the Gulf of Maine. And the first places that they landed, for the most part, were the islands. So Damerscove, Monhegan, all these, and later Islesboro, North Haven, Vital Haven, all these islands were inhabited to one degree or another, sometimes just campsites. And a lot of the islands that are now pretty much barren and empty or have turned back to nature were actually islands where people, fishermen, were coming and landing and using as a base and depositing their apples. And by seed. And go back to the botany lesson, every seed unique. So basically what was happening very early on was that apples were being seeded by people, by fishermen, all over the islands of Maine, and of course with a lot of genetic diversity because everyone was different. So eventually, then people began to venture onto the mainland. And one of the first places, of course, was the Bristol area of the peninsula here. And as early as, I mean, some of you will have your history of the peninsula and the Damerscott area way better than I do. But basically, we'll say certainly around, what, 1650 or maybe even earlier than that, people were here. And, you know, for little bits and then getting discouraged from staying by Native Americans and so forth. And, but as they did that, as they moved on, as Europeans moved on to the mainland, all over the eastern seaboard, they were establishing little farms and they were planting apples. And they were planting apples from seed. So that what happened was, over the course of that period, from roughly, we'll say, 1600 to 1800, so about 200 years, is that there were millions of farms that were being started from here down to Georgia, and eventually out to the Mississippi River, and tens of millions of trees being planted from seed. So now I should mention a word that some of you are very familiar with, which is grafting. So what do you do if you want to replicate your Macintosh and you know or don't know that you cannot do it from seed? Well, what you can do is you can do it by grafting. And so, now I'm gonna just talk about one of these apples here, and we'll pick an early one. This is early, meaning an old variety. This is probably the first named American variety. This is Roxbury Russet. This originated in Roxbury, which is part of Boston, as you know, and it was probably planted from seed, we'll say somewhere around 1630 or so. And Roxbury was incorporated in 1630, so this was very early. And the whole Boston Peninsula there was all farms, you know. And then, so what would have happened would be let's say we were all, and this was going on all over, this what I'm about to talk about was going on all over the place, including right here. So we would be, if we were all living in, what was for most people either Nobleboro or Newcastle at that point, Damascotta didn't exist yet, we would be, let's say we had a big potluck dinner and we were all here together and we all brought apples, and I brought this one. And you took a bite and you said, oh boy, I want that apple in my orchard. And I said to you, well, sure, just cut it open and take the seed. And you said, I don't want the seed, I want the apple. I want that, whatever it was. And they all were beginning to develop names. Of course, they were just from seed. So the names, well, we're getting ahead of ourselves. But anyway, so that's where grafting came in. Now, when you graft, grafting is asexual propagation. It's like starting something from a cutting. And many of you who have started plants, mostly herbaceous plants from rooted cuttings, it's the same idea. It's just that apples do not root easily as a cutting. So as the same with most tree fruits. So when you, this is my little prop, when you graft, what you do is this. If you look at this is kind of hard to see, and probably I should have a big slide of it or something, but I decided not to. But if you look at this, you might be able to see, this is last summer's growth, and it ends right there at that sort of node. This is last summer's growth and ends right there. This is last summer's growth and ends right there. So this is a fairly vigorous apple tree. Not super vigorous, but pretty good. So when you graft, you take a little piece. Pretend now here's our Macintosh. You take a little piece of the variety. This is the variety. This is from the Macintosh tree. And you take a little piece that big. That's all you need. In fact, if you use a piece bigger than that, it probably won't be successful. And when a graft is successful, we say it takes. So you take this little teeny piece, which is called a scion, like that. Isn't there a car called Scion, or science, the word science? They take this little tiny scion and you splice it onto a tree with roots. And that tree with roots, which is an apple tree, is called the rootstock. So when you graft this on to a rootstock, then from that junction on, you get Macintosh, or in this case, Roxbury Russet, or whatever it is. Here's Ben Davis, and we'll talk about Ben Davis. Here's Baldwin here, and so forth. Any of these, you cut the scion wood, you graft it on, and from that junction on, you get the variety, whatever it is. This is how you replicate. So the first Macintosh, and I'm picking on Macintosh here, the first Macintosh that ever was came from a seed. Every other Macintosh tree that ever was came from a graft. So if you go into an orchard and you see row after row after row after row of Macintosh, and then you see rows of Honeycrisp and so forth, every one of those trees was produced from a graft. So what began to happen was this, that everyone had an orchard pretty much. And one of the things that I love about Maine is that, and apples, is that all 16 counties of Maine had apples. So it's something that ties us all together. Some parts of Maine are famous for their lobster or their fishing or their potatoes or whatever, their granite, whatever you want, or their pine trees. But every part of Maine, every county of Maine, every town of Maine had apples. So it is something fun that ties us all together historically. So anyway, all over the place, from here to Georgia and from here to the Mississippi, people were growing apples from seed, and then periodically, every so often, noticing, you know what? That apple is really good for something or other. Maybe it's good for a pie. Maybe it keeps all winter. For example, you go out there in November, and look, those apples are still hanging on the tree, and they're still hard as rocks. So you take those apples, you put them in your root cellar, or back then, often they would just dig a hole in the ground and put the apples in and cover it with hay or salt marsh hay or something. And then in March, they dig it all up, and the apples would still be great. And with no Shop and Save back then, or Hannaford's, or even Whole Foods, they had to produce their own. And you know, obviously there were very few, there weren't any bananas or oranges, so everybody needed their own fruit. They quickly realized that apples are particularly wonderful in that respect because some apples ripen in July and some apples ripen really in March. And the ones that ripen in March can be absolutely exquisitely delicious, but you pick them in late October, as late as you dare, before they freeze on the tree. You don't want them to freeze. And then you store them, and over time the starches turn to sugars, and you wind up with something really delicious that you can use all spring long. Now, the other thing that people realized is that these different apples are good for different things. So some apples, and we were talking about this a little bit before the talk got going, some of these apples taste terrible if you eat them for dessert. A dessert apple is just fresh. That's a dessert, or as they say in England, with a knife. So some apples, they don't taste good if you eat them like this, but does that mean that they're no good? Not necessarily. Some of the best apples for pies or for various other dishes, but we'll pick on pies here. Some of the best pie apples do not taste very good if you eat them fresh. So you cannot be deceived. You need to make a pie out of them and see what they'll do. Macintosh makes a terrible pie. That's because it turns to soup in the pie. And so if you want an applesauce pie, that's a really good apple to use, is Macintosh. But if you want a pie that holds its shape and has a really good flavor, then you don't want to use a Macintosh. You might want to use something like, say, well, in the summer around here, Gravenstein, if you've heard of Gravenstein. Another one is Red Astrakhan that was grown around here. Another one, Wealthy. And then later on in the season, coming around now, Northern Spy would be just absolutely perfect in a pie. Baldwin's very good in a pie, too. Many of these varieties still exist, but in very limited quantities. So anyway, so they began to name the apples, and they named them, this was, in many cases, the names changed from town to town, or county to county, or state to state, because people were, this was not a commodity agricultural system that we had back then. Basically, these were small, diversified farms. People were growing the fruit primarily for themselves and for the local market. So if a variety was called one thing in one town and another thing in another town, nobody cared. It didn't make any difference. It wasn't like what happened eventually where we got into this whole thing of commodity agriculture. It was a very different thing. So people just named the apples whatever they felt like, usually after themselves or after the town they lived in or something about the place, you know, something. This is black gillyflower here. I don't know where it got its name, but it has a funny shape. This is gray pear Maine. You know, so one of my favorite apples in the last few years is an apple called hurlbut, and it was named, but it's named for the hurlbut family, which is a Connecticut family, and the apple comes from Central Connecticut. And I like to say, you know, today, you know, we call them things like Gala and Honeycrisp, but back there they called them hurlbut, you know. So they weren't trying to market them, you know, the way that we are today. They weren't patenting them, they weren't marketing them, they weren't advertising them. So anyway, so all these apples began to get named, passed around, grafted, and so forth. But still, until probably a little bit into the 19th century, most orchards were seedling orchards. And that was because most of the fruit that people used was for animal food, for cider, and for vinegar. And for all of those, and I won't go into it too deeply, but for all of those, you don't need a dessert apple. You don't need an apple that has that balance that we're looking for when we eat a Honeycrisp or a Fuji or something. In fact, in a lot of cases, you don't want those. But there were many other purposes for which apples were selected. Just to give you an idea, there's a whole class of apples. There's one over in the display there of what are called sweet apples. And there's Tolman sweet, pound sweet, pumpkin sweet. There's a whole bunch of them still around in Maine. And those sweet apples have a very high sugar content and a very low acid content. And when we eat Honeycrisp, which is one that probably most of you have heard of, a very modern apple, it is actually not a sweet apple. It is an apple that is balanced sweet and acidity. And for our modern palate, that's what we like to eat. We like something that has some acidity and some sugar. Many of these old varieties were selected because they had virtually no acidity at all. Now those can be a good dessert fruit for somebody that has low acid tolerance. They're very good for cattle because cattle don't like acid. The acidity in certain fruit is bad for their digestion. And they would also use them to make molasses. So you take a very sweet apple that has very low acidity, you press it into cider, now you have an insipid cider that to us would taste terrible. But you take that cider, you boil it down like you would maple syrup, and now you've got a thick molasses, and we've made this, and it's absolutely delicious. It tastes just like molasses. And for people that did not have access to sugar, because of the isolation of where people live, this was a great substitute for sugar. So I think you get the idea. So now I think what I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about this area, and I'm going to pick on one apple in particular. But first, there's a wonderful article from the Lincoln County News from 2004, which quotes various experts, including George Dow. Probably some of you knew George Dow. I was fortunate to meet him and spend some time with him before he died. But one of the first orchards here was one planted by a man named Walter Phillips on the western bank of the Damascotta River, and he had these varieties. And I'm going to quote here. They had their names, some of which I recollect, and this was his great-grandson talking in 1800s. They had their names, some of which I recollect. For instance, Rusty Coat, a delicious little apple shaped like a strawberry, rather dry. Bailey apple. Long John. Betsy apple, a family apple from the mealy appearance of its skin. Walter Phillip had been driven from his land about 1675 by the Indians. Now, those varieties, I have heard of Rusty Coat, but I think that Rusty Coat may be something that was a name that was attributed or placed on a lot of different apples. And one of the issues that I have when I'm doing the work that I do is that often, as I said, often different apples have the same apple have different names in different locations, but also different apples often have the same name, especially apples like, well, there's one called pumpkin sweet, and I've found at least 4 or 5 different pumpkin sweets around New England, and I believe that it's not that somebody had it wrong. I think pumpkin sweet is just a wonderful name. It's a big apple, it looks like a pumpkin, whatever, and it's sweet. So there are all these different apples called pumpkin sweet. Anyway, what I do is I try to track down these rare varieties, and sometimes I have a name, but I have no fruit. And I use a bunch of different methods to try to track down the apple if I have the name. One of them is I made these wanted posters. So in this case, this is an apple called, and you can all see this, it's called the Gibbons apple, and it originated in Thompson. I tried to pick one that this morning that was, you know, fairly close to here. And you know, I have a terrible description of it. You know, it just says medium to large, conical, red, and October and November. But it does say fine, white, juicy flavor, high sprightly subacid. Subacid means tart. And I'm not going to go too deeply into the Gibbons. I actually think I may have found one. But in some cases, what I've been able to do is I've been able to find who was the person who originated this apple. And that has led me to, in some cases, to identifying apples from these wanted posters. And I have lots of wanted posters. But sometimes I have the name, but I don't have the apple. In other cases, I have the apple, but not the name. And so I work both ways, and it's a little bit like being Sherlock Holmes or you know, Johnny Depp with you know, Pirates of the Caribbean or something. I'm in search of sunken treasure or at least hidden treasure. I don't want the apples dead or alive, though. I'm really looking for them if they're only alive. But anyway, so one of the apples that I have really focused on for the last 20 years or so is an apple called Kavanaugh. And I thought I'd pick on Kavanaugh because, you know, if you're from around here, I hope you've heard of James Kavanaugh. So James Kavanaugh, and what he did was sort of typical of what went on years and years ago. He grew up in Ireland, and in about 1780 he left Ireland, and I believe that was the year that Irish were first allowed to leave and go to America. So there were some big changes going on over there. Of course, they were really squabbling with the British and so forth. But anyway, he left, and he left with his friend Matthew Cottrell, I believe that's how you pronounce his name. And they went to Boston, and then eventually the two of them came up to Nobleboro. And they had some money, and I don't exactly know, and I'm not sure if anybody knows exactly how they got going, but when they came up here, they established basically a service outfitting ships. And already at that point, they were here, and in about 1790 they got to Nobleboro. And they became very rich very quickly. And in about 5 years after they got here, they bought the mills up at the head of the lake. And they bought them from William Vaughan, who had started the mills. And they bought a lot of land. They had mills. Eventually, they built shipyards. When that whole area became shipyards, and all up and down the river and so forth. And the reason, and you know, I'm sure, you know, as I say, probably a lot of you know way more about this than I do, but as far as I can tell, the reason why Nobleboro exists is because of those waterfalls. But anyway, there was an apple, and that apple, which I didn't bring today because it would be gone by right now. It's an earlier apple, and we did have some this year, but they're all in the compost heap now. But it looks sort of like a Roxbury Russet, but it's very distinctly different too. It's a russeted apple, and nobody knows how that apple originated, but the apple Kavanaugh is an apple that we would say originated in Nobleboro. what happened was probably either James Kavanagh brought it from Ireland as a seed or as a small tree in a tub. And if he brought it as a seed, then of course it was a new and unique variety, but we don't really know. And if he brought it in a tub, then he brought a variety over from Ireland. And there's no variety in Ireland called Kavanagh. There is a variety called Cathead, and Cathead is a sort of a class of apples with a certain shape that looks like a cat's head. So it's sort of conical, it sort of comes down and then sort of is rounded at the bottom when there's the stem up there. And so some people think that it might be this old variety from Ireland and England called cathead or cat's head. And some people think, well, it originated in Damerscott or Nobleborough. And so what I like to think is that each one of these apples is like a crystal ball. And in that apple is the past, and the past, by the past I mean the history. So when we think of the Kavanagh apple, we can go back and look at how did Nobleborough get started, what were the mills all about, who was James Kavanagh, who was Matthew Cottrill, what was going on in Bristol, what was happening here. It's all in that apple. And each one of these apples has a story, has a history like that. This one I mentioned, Great Pear, Maine, from Skowhegan. And what was Skowhegan? Why is Skowhegan called Skowhegan? Who were the people that lived there? What went on in Norridgewock, which is right above Skowhegan? Some big things happened in Norridgewock. And so in these apples is the history, really, of Maine. There's also a story, and I differentiate a little bit between the story and the history. Because, for example, in the Kavanagh apple, well, I'm going to try to hold that thought about the Kavanagh apple and go back to 1800. Starting at about 1800, we began the slow march throughout the 19th century from the small diversified farm to the commodity farm that we think of today. That was the big century. In some ways, people think about the 20th century as being this century of great change. To me, it was the 19th century. The 19th century is just unbelievable, the difference between one end of it, so to speak, and the other. There were no railroads in 1800. They hadn't even been invented yet, for example. But anyway, what was going on in the 19th century was this slow change from the seedling orchard to the grafting orchard, to the grafted orchard. And in that, basically you went from the small diversified farm to the commodity orchard. And so many of the varieties got lost along the way. By the middle of the 19th century, there were somewhere around 20,000 named American varieties. So things were just hopping. But then by the end of the 19th century, the varieties were being lost just as fast as they had been founded, because of this decision that was made by a number of people, and actually a rather small number of people in some cases, that we did not want to go with the model that they have in Europe, where in Europe, in many places in Europe, you can get this cheese here, and this cheese here, and this cheese here, and you go one town over and you get a totally different cheese or a totally different wine. And we could have done that here with apples. We have such a rich culture of apples. You can imagine 20,000 varieties, where you could have gone on an apple tour the way people go on wine tours and travel down to North Carolina from Maine, and every county you would come up with different apple varieties. But we didn't go that route. So a lot of varieties were lost, or we think were lost. And so So that's where the story comes in. And the story of the Kavanaugh is that in 1950, there was, and I think I brought it, there's a hilarious article in a Boston paper that in 1950, there was a Kavanaugh tree that bore fruit in Newcastle. And this is a copy of the article. It says, "Famous apple comes back." You know, it's a little bit like, you know, those tabloids. And the whole thing's sort of written like a tabloid. But I don't think to be funny. But anyway, so what happened was, somebody had an old Kavanaugh tree. There's a few scattered around. Nobody really followed them. They just, you know, they went that route towards Red Delicious and that sort of thing, and Macintosh. But then one year, 1950, somebody's Kavanaugh tree in the backyard, that in the article they say they thought the tree was dead, produced fruit. And all of a sudden there was this like whole thing like, wow, this is really awesome. Here's this old variety, and then blah, 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 and they talk about the Mills and James Kavanaugh and everything else. And then it pretty much got forgotten again. And then I don't know when George Dow moved to Noblesboro, but when he moved, he became, and he was retired at that point, he became really interested in local history, and one thing led to another, and he became interested in the Kavanaugh apple again. And then probably about 20 years ago or so, some friends of mine introduced me to George Dow. And at that point, he told me about the apple. He took me to the West Neck Road, where there was one, he thought, one tree left. And I took Cyanwood and grafted a few trees, and eventually we've brought it back to the point now where every few years we graft a few trees, put it into the Fedco catalog. It's not a big seller, but we're slowly getting it back out into you know, the public and into people's homes. And so to me, that's sort of the story. So you have the history, James Kavanaugh and so forth, and then you have the story. How do these things get saved? And we're going to say goodbye to the video camera, so now the rest is just yours. No one else will ever see this. And but actually, I'm gonna dip back into the crystal ball and the history again about Kavanaugh. One of the interesting things about the Kavanaugh history is that I thought, and George thought, that we would just find it here, and we wouldn't find it anywhere else. I have never seen it inland, but a few years later, after I became interested in the apple, and I got to tell you, this is one apple. You can imagine I've got hundreds of these stories, but anyway, somebody in a Rousick told me about an apple there, brought it to me, and I wish I had, you know, we should do this talk in September, then we could all taste Kavanaugh. But anyway, it was, and it's unmistakable apple and very uniquely shaped. So I knew that they had it in a Rousick. Then somebody else brought me an apple from Blue Hill, and then I started to see, okay, so what was going on here? So we have this, whatever it is, 19-mile-long Damerscott River, and at the end of the river, we've got the whole world right in front of us. And so from what I could tell, the Kavanaugh apple was being deposited in coastal communities by different people who were going in the schooners and driving up and down the coast. So then a few years ago, a friend of mine that's really into all this, he's always on the lookout. He's got a great eye, and he likes to find things that I've never seen before. So he found an apple in Freeport. And he's so excited, and he brings me this apple, and he pulls it out, and it's a Kavanaugh. And so that's about, I think by sea, that's from Blue Hill to Freeport, somewhere around 80 miles or so of a span. But the interesting about this apple is never inland. I've never seen it inland. So there was something about it. It was a coastal beast. People liked it. They passed it out along as they went in from harbor to harbor. So the history. Then the last part of the crystal ball is, okay, so you have this apple. You've got this cool story about local historians trying to save it or whatever. But it's just a widget at that point. What are you going to use it for? And that's the other part, is that each one of these apples is valuable for what you used it for. What is this? What are you going to do with this thing? Are you going to make cider out of it? Are you going to throw it at people? You know, what do you want? What do you want out of this fruit? And that's one of the most interesting parts for us, because what people did not do very often is leave information about how to use the apples. And why didn't they do that? Well, I think one of the main reasons why they didn't do it is because everybody knew. If you lived in Nobleboro and you had a Kavanaugh apple, of course everybody knew. Not only that, for the same reason they didn't label the trees. You know, so you go around, people bring me dozens, hundreds of apples to identify every year. And I think, you know, why didn't they just label the trees or make a map or something? But, you know, everybody knew them. They were household words. You know, when I moved to Palermo, which was in 1972, there was not a road name on one road in town. And I wasn't even sure of the name of the road that I lived on. And I wasn't really. I thought it was called the Jones Road, but there was no sign anywhere. And I thought, well, why isn't that? Well, you know, that's because everybody there had lived there for, you know, 5 generations. They all knew the names of the roads. They didn't need it to be named. But it's like, you know, do you put names on your children's shirt? You know, Susie, you know, a lot of this stuff was just, we've got to refigure it out. And so what we do is, very early on, I taught myself how to make a pie, because I figured, you know what, I can't rely on other people to make all these pies, and I wanted to figure out which ones make good pies. So every time we get a new variety in, a new old variety, the first thing, make it into sauce, make it into a pie, dry it, you know, eat it fresh, you know, have your friends taste it, you know, whatever. There's a little funny story, very short, that one of the MOFGA apprentices come and live on our farm, young adults, and one of them said, we were having a pie that day, she said, that was the worst tasting apple I ever tasted, and the best tasting pie I ever tasted. So you just don't know. And people taste these things. My commercial orchard friends taste them and they say, that's a spinner. But you know what? Try to go to a commercial orchard in Maine and get a good pie apple. You know, for the most part, you can't. Although that is beginning to change. You know, now more and more these commercial orchards are growing a few Northern Spies again, or a few Baldwins, or a few whatever it happens to be, fill in the blank. So if you, okay, I'm going to go 10 more minutes, and then no matter what, I'm going to stop, and then we'll do questions. So one of the things about Kavanaugh, I should read you. This is from, I can't remember what this is from. This is something from what George Dow gave me, but this is something about Kavanaugh. And it's good for other things too, but this is fun. Okay. This is a fried treat with Kavanaugh. Fry in pork fat. Add water as necessary till soft. Then add a few dollops of molasses. Serve with biscuits. So there you go. That's Kavanaugh. So several years ago, Russell Libby, who some of you may have known, and you know, the wonderful, now sadly deceased executive director of MOFGA for many years, and who I feel very fortunate was a very, very good friend of mine, and we did a lot of this fruit exploring together. He was always on the lookout for old trees. The ones that are this big, hollow, broken down, those are the ones that I really like. And so he and I devised a plan, and it was largely under his, his imagination, I would say, to create this orchard. And the orchard would be about somewhere, we don't know, 500, 600, 700 of these traditional apples that were grown in Maine, like Kavanaugh, like some of these others. And so MOFGA, who, and probably many of you have been to the fair, owns several hundred acres, and part of the land is a really spent, degraded gravel pit. And the USDA came to us and with cost sharing through NRCS, the National Resources Conservation Service, asked us if we would want to partner with them in reclaiming this pit, and we wanted to do that. And so they would do a cost share with us. And so so Russell suggested that we turn the gravel pit into an orchard, and that this would be a model for how to reclaim degraded land. And so we brought it to the board of directors at MOFGA. We spent a lot of time talking with a lot of people around the state about, is this a good idea, and so forth, and we got a lot of excellent feedback all over the place. And then finally got the board of directors to unanimously approve of the idea under the stipulation that we would, although we would be part of MOFGA, and we would raise our own money to do this particular project, so they weren't interfering with all the other educational and various other work that MOFGA does. So last summer, we did some major earthwork to the gravel pit, and we terraced about 3 acres of it. It's a 10-acre pit. Parts of it where it was very steeply sloped and just totally eroded, we cut it back and then changed the angle of the pit, and we've done a lot of work to it. It's not completed, the entire earthwork, but we probably did about 3/4 of the earthwork that we'll eventually do. And then, as I said, about 2 to 3 acres were terraced, and those have all been marked out for the first trees that are going to be planted. And meanwhile, we grafted approximately 100 varieties to be the first planting there. And some of those varieties are ones that we don't even know the names of yet. They're ones where I found the tree. I know from this point, because of how much I've done this, when I find a sort of new old variety, I can tell pretty much instantly if I've ever seen it before, and I can identify many, and I'm working on identifying a lot of the others, but some, because they were local varieties, as we said, like the road names with no signs, we may never find out what the names are, but I can tell how uniquely wonderful they are. One that will be in the orchard is this one, and the USDA in about 1900 they hired artists to paint 6,000 apples. And this is just a photocopy. These watercolors are unbelievable. They are the most beautiful apples, beautiful apple pictures I've ever seen. This one is called Northern Belle. Each one is labeled, and this one says here, number 16763, Northern Belle, from E.W. Dunbar, Damascotta, Lincoln County, Maine, November 22nd, 1898. And so this was painted on November 22nd, 1898. This fall, a fellow who I have all these moles around the state, you can be one of them too if you want, who find me these old trees, and then they call me and they say, you know, okay, you know, time to come visit. Well, this is, there's a fellow named Pete Jenkins up in Prospect, and he found a bunch of apples this fall, and one of them, actually 2 or 3 of them, he wound up giving me fruit, and one of them is the spitting image of this, and I'm pretty sure we found it. So that one, you know, it's just this is just another one of the tools that I use as I'm trying to identify these beautiful old watercolors. But anyway, so what we're doing is, so we've got it set up now for approximately the first 100 varieties. Those will be planted on April 12th, and on that Saturday. We'd love to have you come. We're expecting a big crowd, and we're hoping we're going to teach people how to plant trees, and we're going to plant all these different trees on these terraces, and it really is a remarkable sight. It looks a little bit like a cross between the Peruvian terraces in South America and the Vietnamese rice paddy terraces in Vietnam. It's pretty amazing. And also, when we do this, we're going to plant, we're going to grow the apples in what we call a polyculture, not a monoculture. The apple orchards of today are mostly a monoculture. So what we're going to do is and that's what some of those handouts are. You're welcome to take them. Even if you never plant an apple tree, you might find them interesting. And there's more information in our catalog about what we're doing, how we do this, how we plan to plant these. We're going to surround these plants with what we call companions. So these will be herbaceous and woody plants. Some of them will fruit. Some of them will simply improve the soil, because they're very deeply rooted and reach down deeply and bring up minerals and so forth. And some of them improve the soil because the herbaceous tops, fall over, rot, and create organic matter. Others attract pollinators or attract beneficial insects and provide habitat for them. So basically, we're going to grow these in a way where we will be exploring and modeling how to do an orchard in a way that is very different from the model that has been used for, say, the last 150 years or so. So that's a little bit about, it's now just about 11 o'clock. Let me quickly see if there's something else here that I missed. Well, there's a lot, but what the heck. I'm just going to wrap up by saying, what can you do? First of all, if you have to leave, it's 11 o'clock. Thank you for coming, and just duck out whenever you need to. Second of all, if you have questions, as I say, I'll stay as long as you like. And third of all, you can become a mole. So if you keep a lookout for old trees. And the trees, really seriously, you might look at a tree and you might think, well, I don't know if this is old. Well, the tree that I'm looking for is this tree. Pretend that you invite a friend of yours from, whatever, Australia to come visit you. And the friend has never seen an apple tree in their life. So they don't even know what an apple tree looks like. The apple tree that I'm looking for is the two of you are out together on a walk, and they see a tree, and they go, oh my God, that tree is so old. That's the one that I want. So somebody that doesn't even know what an apple tree is. And generally I'm looking for the ones that are like this. And the Kavanaugh tree that George and I took cyanwood off of, 25 years ago, it wasn't even as tall as this screen here. It was probably about that tall. But the thing was this big around, the whole top was broken off, and there were big shoots coming out of it, and it was completely hollow. Anybody will look at that and go, wow, is that old? Is it alive? Well, those are the ones that probably, if we were going to find those ones that, if we were going to find those trees that Walter Phillips planted, what were they, those old names, Long John or Betsy, or, you know, those are going to be the trees. Some of the trees that we are putting in there, there's a couple from Bremen. There's maybe some of you know Jeff Cotton. He's got a tree. It's like this. It's probably 60 feet tall. And we just call it Hezekiah Keene. That's Keene Neck down there where he lives. Well, Hezekiah Keene was the name of the man who started the farm, or who was, you know, had the farm, you know, the early days or something. These are very old trees, and they're part of our heritage. They're part of a story, and they're part of they have a potential for the future of agriculture in Maine. These are local varieties. We're so into local now. For these people, local was not a fad. This was the way they lived. This was it. We can learn a lot from these people. So, thank you very much.